I'd love just to start with Philip, because Philip did this magical thing. You know, you achieved what every founder wants to achieve one day. Is like start with an idea, build a company, and then take it to the phase where it's not only profitable but growing tremendously and starts like catching the attention for exit and growth partners. So please introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your phenomenal story with Comex.
Are you guys doing roundouts afterwards? Yeah? Okay. Hi everyone, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. When Michael contacted us, I think around, I would say only 2 weeks ago, it was an absolute no-brainer that I would love to be on this panel. And my name is Philip, I'm 35 years old, recently married, originally Northern German, studied at a very, very scrappy small school, mechanical engineering at some point, which led me to Schindler Elevators, and I got to spend some time at Google before it was cool, between 2010 and 2012 after that, which really changed my life in the terms of going from machinery towards digital. And seeing Google, this massive juggernaut back then based in Dublin, and Facebook and LinkedIn and all those companies grew so significantly through the power of actually B2B sales teams, coming back to the mainland of Europe, realizing that we really do have a problem in the terms of sales operations, how we run our teams and our commercial mindset. So this never left me. Fast forward, then I took a break, did my master's, which led me through a coincidence to the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town, where I met my co-founder till this day, Peter. And ever since then, we've been exploring the space of sales enablement for SMBs. And this was the evolvement, how Comex was founded. Comex today is a company with around 180 people between Germany and South Africa, and also remote across the globe. We help companies streamline their sales operations processes, specifically when it comes to finding message market fit, shortening deal cycles, and data analytics on CRM. And this is basically our story. I'm happy to answer any questions. The big thing for us was that we've kind of made this axle happen between Germany and South Africa. And also, I will probably have the more European perspective on this, full disclosure. But I'll try to be here to respond to any questions on that.
Cool, thank you. Daniel, representing Carlsquare today. Thank you so much for being here with us today as well.
Yeah, absolutely glad to be here. So, and thank you for inviting us. I'm a colleague of Mark, which some of you are familiar with. So I'm a partner with Carlsquare, which is a corporate finance boutique, originally coming from Hamburg, but now with offices in other cities in Europe and also in San Francisco. So, and we are focusing basically on transactions, deal size, so at a later stage. So we are mainly doing transactions starting from 25 million, 30 million enterprise value up to 400, 500 million enterprise value. So typical situation is founder-driven business at the next stage, or looking into the next stage. Yeah? So a little bit of de-risk is mostly one of the intentions, but also to stay with the business and then grow it together with, in most of the cases, together with a private equity company to the next level. So to accelerate growth for another 5 years, or even doing a secondary for another 10 years. So with having said that, we are focused on 5 verticals, which is software, business services, consumer businesses, but more D2C consumer businesses, life science, and industrial tech. So, and I'm sitting here because I advised Philip and his team and co-founders in the transaction where we identified Flex Capital, which is a Berlin-based private equity company, focusing purely on tech companies, mainly in software space. So, and this was more or less a very typical transaction for us. So a very successful company, already cash generative, highly cash generative in this case. So looking for the next step. So, and that's what we did, and we will come to that later on.
Hi, I'm Margaret. I'm the chair lady of Launch Africa. I'm based in London. I spend a lot of my time with LPs, both in Launch Africa and potential secondary buyers of Launch Africa portfolio companies in venture capital and private equity, as well as corporate. I spent 20 years on the ground in Africa working with big banks and insurance companies on their digital transformation strategies at a board level and connecting them to tech startup talent. So I'm very familiar with some of the unique challenges, especially regulatory uncertainty in certain African geographies. And a lot of my work here in Germany this week is talking to German corporates about the African youth dividend and how we could potentially help build stronger bridges of human capital between Europe and Africa. And really excited to be here with all of you.
Cool. Hey, my name is Louis. Originally from South Africa. I guess my background would be in a long string of very unsuccessful startups over the years. Some of them kind of mediocrely okay later on. But yeah, so I run a company called The Delta. We're a venture builder or a venture catalyst. We're based between Europe and predominantly South Africa. We have around just over 200 people that help startups from pretty much the beginning all the way through to the end. We have a balance sheet portfolio of about 40-something ventures at the moment between both, so split between Africa and Europe. And yeah, I mean, I've kind of worked with a range of different founders who have been at whatever combination of either having teams based in South Africa, teams based in Africa, markets in Europe, teams in Europe, markets in Africa. So, a range of different combinations of how that does and doesn't work. And yeah, really interested to kind of see like how that whole axis that we were talking about here between kind of, I guess, Europe and Africa, and particularly Germany and Africa, really can help us understand how to play it better, right? So yeah, I thought.
Cool. Thanks, Louis. There I'm back. So yeah, like let's maybe dive straight in with that aspect. Philip, you were mentioning earlier that you have teams both in South Africa, as well as here in Germany. And could you maybe share with us and the audience a little bit of like how that kind of relationship to have these two or office sites, how does it actually contribute to the success of comics, and where do you see the advantages of having like intercontinental offices, but also where are a little bit of the challenges with that?
So there were a bunch of questions, and I'm just trying to tell a little bit of that story, because I could sit here now after 5 years saying this was also straightforward, and most of the stuff is not, although some people might want to give you that impression. So for us, we didn't quite think about it. We had 3 co-founders. 2 of us were back then based between Berlin and Copenhagen, where we did our studies. Chris and me were in Copenhagen, but I also traveled between South Africa and Denmark back then, mostly because I had actually massive winter blues, don't like the winter, right, go down to Cape Town. That's what you do, and what many people do even more now today. And Pete was always based in South Africa, different life phase, had a family. And when you decide for a co-founder, for us, we just really had that goal of building a business that, number one, would be working sustainably, so we didn't want to do it with investors. And the second thing was eventually that it would run profitably. And if you then run profitably, eventually, and you're doing well, potentially you can then at some point think about doing an exit, right? But this was never the goal. So for us, it wasn't a strategic decision to build between Berlin, Copenhagen, and Cape Town. It was a necessity because that's where we're based, right? What we learned, however, over the course of the time, and looking also, of course, at the exchange rate, that there's terrific currency arbitrage advantages, specifically when you run a service-heavy business. And it turned out for us, although Pete is our CTO and come from a development background, that we wanted to build customer services quite quickly. We wanted to deliver great experiences. And we also found that our target group was in need desperately for specific services. In our case, this is services such as sales team hiring, training, as well as CRM analysis. Now, when you're in that spot, and you may be a little bit switched on how to scale services, make them repeatable, and you can do this without a language barrier for German customers, then South Africa is a fantastic playground, right? We're looking at, the Western Cape, who has a massively educated, I think, youth, I would say, On the same time, although it's terrible for the local population, there's a huge demand for work because we have a high unemployment rate, which is terrible for down there. But of course, you as an entrepreneur might have a solution for that in providing real jobs. You have service centers, we just heard this earlier, from Amazon or from Lufthansa, which are very, very specialized in business process outsourcing. So if you want to create service staff with an American mindset, trained by Amazon, it's a great playground to poach there, to be honest, if you offer the right perks. So based on this perspective, we drove a lot of the technical side of things, the data side of things that required, data ops and quite accurate labor, as well as services and support. So this was our setup, right? As we grew further and as our development teams matured, we also hired more tech development from UX, design, those things down there. Not specifically actually for cost reasons, but also because available talent, and we had an office there, which was quite intriguing for most. And as we now mature even further, it actually goes beyond Cape Town with more developers also based in Nigeria and Turkey, etc. But the big thing for us, I guess, was number one, necessity, because we just worked where we lived. Number two was seeing what the business needed and trying to make the most out of those locations where we were. And now third, becoming a more global and professional operation is really around just not being afraid of doing certain things clearly remotely with the right people in place. Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. Now, Daniel, I would like to phrase a question for you. Now, predominantly addressed to the founders who are here today and also have signed on from a digital perspective. It was kind of the first deal that you guys did from between the continents. And in the briefing we had, we were chatting about the cultural differences. Is this were there other kind of aspects of the due diligence process that were quite important, or what was how did the process look like, and what did investors or a partner such as Flex Capital think about that the company of Philip, that Comics was operating between the continents? What were the learnings? Were there any specifics on the scenario? Could you just share with us a little bit how that all went through?
Yes, happy to do so. So I think when we first met, we first have to find out what kind of company is it? Is it more a South African company? Is it a European company? Is it a Berlin-based company? And so I think we decided from very early on to present it as an international company. Company language was always English. The mindset was, you have so many nations working for you. So that was crystal clear from day one, and then it was also quite clear that we want to predominantly approach financial sponsors, i.e. private equity investors. So, and per se, they are very open for international companies, mainly from Europe, but also from abroad. So, nevertheless, we were aware that there's a positive connotation in Germany towards South Africa. Yeah, I would definitely say that. Most of the people have been there, or at least have friends who have traveled there regularly. So it's a positive, especially when it comes to Africa. This is definitely one of the countries where most people have a relationship to. So which was very easy for us to put it into the presentation and into the story. But then I think what was different from a typical European transaction was then that the focus of the due diligence was a little bit different. So normally I would always say the main topic of a due diligence is always commercial due diligence, which is also the case here, but with regard to the South African branch, the commercial aspects were not that much of importance. Also not the financials were that much of importance. That was all checked more or less here for the German company. But what was important from day one was always to convince them that everything has been set up in a, and you can imagine that Germany is, especially with those aspects, very strict, that this has been set up in a transparent way, that is from a legal perspective, that it's diligenceable, also from a tax perspective. So no one in Germany, also from the big law firms, had any experience with South Africa. So we have to rely on local friends of the law firms. So we call it friends, yeah, it's not personal relationships, but law firms, befriended law firms, which gives you an expert opinion on tax aspects. And then it comes, in the case of COMEX, a big topic was also labor law. So are they on the payroll? How is the system there? And I think that was the difference, because this is normally a ticket box in German due diligence, yeah? Legal, I mean, of course it's important, and maybe there are lawyers among you, but I would say this is not moving the needle in a transaction, yeah, normally. So the same goes for tax. So if commercial and financial is over, I'm always totally relaxed on a transaction. But in this case, I think that is an important topic, and you have to tackle this early on, yeah? Be prepared when it comes to the structure, be prepared when it comes to tax, be prepared when it comes to labor law issues, or not issues, but topics, and in general, be a little bit more prepared in a more structured way compared, give 110%, put it like this, yeah? Because this is, because per se, as I said, people are very positive about South Africa, but nevertheless, it makes life much easier if you tackle on those issues early on in the due diligence.
Cool. Thanks, Uli. Yeah, Margaret, please.
Daniel, that was like an advertisement for the governance toolkit that we're working on with a digital collective action, Launch Africa, African Venture Capital Association. So a huge area of focus for us going forward is to ensure that entrepreneurs from pre-seed to seed understand how their governance needs to evolve, and from seed to Series A, how it needs to become more sophisticated, going from an advisory board to a fiduciary board. And, you know, Launch Africa is extremely interested in ensuring that all the entrepreneurs in the ecosystem understand the vital importance of audited accounts and accurate and up-to-date financial reporting, because of how much of a leverage that gives you in negotiations for follow-on rounds. So, you know, just thank you so much for being really transparent about this story, because we know, especially in the current funding environment, where follow-on rounds are slower to close and the possibility of trade sales, like it's all going to take more time. So as there's more trust in the data around African startups, these follow-on deals will be much easier to do. The trade sales will be much easier to do. So we're really trying to have like positive peer pressure among entrepreneurs and have a common set of expectations for venture capital investors at different life stages. Like, we will not pass on a Series A deal until we have 110% confidence in the data of that company.
Absolutely, and let me add, I mean, those kind of deals are always driven by two parts. There's the deal team who's excited, who likes the founders and wants to pursue. So, but then you always have some others in the ICs, yeah, who are not in the deal team, and in the banks when it comes to private equity. And those people, I don't know why this is the case, but they tend to focus on things where you might have an issue. So, and they always come up with those little stupid, annoying questions. So, and it's good if you are prepared and you can convince them very early on, because then later, the better you are prepared, the earlier they start questioning the transaction.
And you just said that there wasn't a German lawyer who understood the African ecosystem. So I mentioned to you I was in HGG in Bonn at an ecosystem event 3 weeks ago and met, he self-described as one of the most important German lawyers in VC. And I had invited him to this event, he didn't show up. But, you know, I think also to have these professional partnerships, like with, you know, the lawyers you prefer to do business with, like Launch Africa is definitely educating a lot of global lawyers involved in M&A about this is what's happening in the ecosystem, so that, again, the companies are prepared for what's coming down the pipeline.
Perfect.
Junaid says, this is a relay race, and, you know, it really requires an ecosystem approach to ensuring everyone's aligned as to what is the normal for African tech.
Absolutely. And I mean, if I may add another question to this point, because what we're seeing on the continent, and also when it comes to building these bridges, looking at DFIs, putting more money into the continent, like increasing the interest for foreign investors. Like one big question that funds are facing is, hey guys, it's incredible what you're doing, but what about the exits? How is that looking like? And from both of your, Luis and Margaret's perspectives, like, do you think like are the majority of good performing African ventures, are they ready to scale to Europe and follow a similar path like Philip? How are we doing on that front?
I mean, once again, there's a few questions in there. Yeah, I would say, I think I wanted to just make one point on the last thing, also just about, I think there's something to be said about the toolkit and being prepared and helping founders be prepared about what questions are going to come up in some of these kind of cross-border transactions. I think that's definitely one of the big parts, right? The second big part that I've kind of started to see over the last 2-3 years is actually, and something I kind of wholeheartedly believe, is that capital follows trust, right? And trust is really a thing between people. I mean, systems can trust each other, so the governance systems can trust each other, but like people need to know people. And like over the last few years, you start to see more and more relationships form between the two markets. Like I think 2 months ago, I got a WhatsApp from Michael saying he saw me outside Späti somewhere in Berlin, and completely randomly, didn't know you were here, didn't know I was here, and that kind of thing is basically where someone calls you up and says, the governance stuff we can do, but is this deal a go? And that is how it happens. Someone says, this deal is a go. I will make sure this deal works. I've got you. That part is actually what I feel precedes a lot of the toolkit stuff, because you've got to get the people that are in the IC that are not excited by making money, right? They're the people that are excited by not losing money. They're the people that are going to get stuck on that kind of stuff, right? And if they know someone else, a friend on the other side that says, don't worry, you can stop hyperventilating. You're not going to lose all this money. Okay, you might, but you're probably not going to lose it for the reasons you think you're going to lose it, right? It's like the deal team's fault. That is a big missing part that I find that if that scales, the rest of it kind of follows. I don't know if you want to say something to that.
I'm just observing a bunch of pale people on this panel and talking about trust. Yes, we're all growing friends of Africa. It's so important that we have a diverse and inclusive approach to building these trust networks. And again, I'm really proud at Launch Africa to be one of the only foreign seers. We're the two foreigners. We're an African team, and we're all about finding African talent, and for raw African talent that didn't go to a global university, helping to have those trust networks in place so that once we trust the entrepreneurs to be able to outperform on their KPIs, they can become part of this global trust network. And I think it's really this collaborative approach where there's value in having some international people in the African ecosystem, but to make space and to shine the light on the Africans who are really, having the runaway success stories in venture building and creating super sustainable global businesses. So just wanted to state the obvious.
No, absolutely, and I think also yet again back to Africa Arena, this initiative, right? And also, I mean, it's the first show up now in Berlin, and I hope that we'll continue this journey and we'll grow it over the years to, be able also to get more founders from Africa, and to the ones who are here and will be pitching later today. I'm really, really excited that you made it and got the support, actually made the commitment to fly from Africa to Europe, because I mean, if you think it both ways, when I was a founder back in the day in Europe, cash is very tight. And it's not like that for me it was, okay, I'm going to do a business trip to London. I still had to figure out, how am I going to fund it and accommodation. Now, to come from Africa here, it's going to cost you a couple of $1,000s. And who can afford that? That's why initiatives like Africa Arena, Amazon, organizations, and I'm really calling more and more support organizations, please take this seriously and support founders from Africa to come on these trips, because as Louis is saying, and Christoph earlier as well, and Junaid, yes, we are in this Zoom era, and there's a lot of calls happening. But when it comes to trust, me personally, like all the founders that we have in the portfolio that we are working with, I want to meet them. I want to get to know that person, and that works over a dinner, over a meal, maybe over a long workshop, and it's just not the same digitally. So I think it's really this collective mission to like when it comes also to building bridges, help African founders access these markets in person, and therefore we need support organizations and individuals who support these founders to come here. That being said, another question that I have to the entire panel would be, what do you guys think is still missing? Are there any missing links that you feel like there's some shortcomings that African ventures are facing in comparison to European ones, and like how can we as a collective, how can individual firms and startups tackle that? What's your view on that, Philip?
So I guess it depends a lot on what's missing exactly for what, right? And in our scenario, the strategy was quite clear, which also then of course helped in the M&A area, that the commercial side of the business was tackling European markets where the investor or buyer, the future shareholder, also knew their way around. And we did this collectively as a company across many time zones. And I think what I sometimes feel like is for specifically European-based entrepreneurs to find South African talent as co-founders for specifically the technical side, to open up that vast talent pool that is down there on the technical area, to explore the opportunity to build, which has been done in Europe and Portugal massively over the last 10 years, to deploy service centers across the same time zone with a vast talent pool of amazing talent. It's actually up for, I think, the European entrepreneurs to check that out and see what the opportunities are within that. But that's, of course, heavily biased, because that was my journey that I could have not foreseen that way, right? But I always felt there was not as much drive, I think, for European founders to look inside of the whole time zone globally, northern and southern hemisphere, to build something, whereas I got fortunate enough to have that access through the GSB, fell in love with the country, came back ever since, had a co-founder there. But we were always thinking this must be a no-brainer, and this could also be, on the other hand, then for South African or like African founders, be a thing. What can we bring to the table for covering a global market space? I guess so. If you want to do an exit for European private equity funds, and Daniel just said that commercial is a big part. So who is your customer? What's your annual contract value? What's your deal velocity, sales velocity? They will be historically more comfortable with markets they know and business models they know in a market they understand. And then for the African side, of course, this is something we can all work on to make more common. I don't know, I think Louis knows even more about that part probably, right? About the differences between what's your core market defines a lot on where the business is going.
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe jump in on that. So I think what's very, very important to do is actually to start breaking down the different parts of, and this is going to sound very, very obvious, but you break down the business all the way from your customer all the way through to your supply chain, right? So there's a very big difference between being an African startup servicing a European customer base, or a European startup by domicile having South African or African supply chain, whether it's talent or whether it's whatever else it is, and then servicing a European market. There are many combinations of that I found do really not work. So, and sometimes actually it's as difficult to change your customer segment from an African or South African, market to a European market as it might be to actually move from a particular subsegment of like Mittelstand to another one like in Germany. You can't just change your customer segment like once a business is running. It's not a 1-2 punch. So like from a supply chain perspective, South Africa and Africa is super, super exciting because you can have these things, right? And that really makes it interesting. And if you know what you're doing with what you're putting where, and you actually invest in building the trust for that part of your business, so a lot of our ventures actually have built tech hubs in Cape Town. So the talent comes through our company and moves into them. So they have 20, 30 people on payroll directly that they've actually spun out of our like services tech team that they then use very similarly to kind of what you've mentioned, and that works really, really well, right? But the other way is a little bit trickier. So you have to really think through like how you're going to do it. And your experience is also quite common, is most people don't think about this before they start the company. They either find themselves in a favorable way of like how they've mixed the two continents, or a not a favorable way, right? So, I mean, I think there's more, I guess, awareness we could drive around what does work and what people should do. Yeah.
And I'm definitely going to grill you over lunch about kind of the lessons learned and past failures so that we don't compete repeating the same mistakes. So Junaid earlier referenced my obsession with building an professional enterprise sales capability in Africa. So again, feel like we have a lot to learn together. At the previous Africa Arena in Egypt, we started a conversation with Mark Birch from AWS Global Startups, where he wrote a book on enterprise sales, his experience with enterprise sales forums, starting them in the US, and Launch Africa later this year. I think we'll take a leadership role in how do we help startups that are accelerating move from founder-led sales to a professional sales force, and we have future of work companies in our portfolio. So I really think that this is an area, again, where you have slower follow-on VC funding round. How do you drive organic growth, revenue growth in B2B sales environment? And this week in Berlin, we realized that a likely investor in Launch Africa Fund 2 hosts a German language enterprise sales podcast. And he sold his company for over $1 billion to SAP a number of years ago, and that was, with the proceeds for that sale, because he was not diluted. They only got VC funding very late in their scale-up journey. So, he has an incredibly strong track record for talking about enterprise sales in the German context. And I didn't mention in the intro, I was a US-based marketing tech founder earlier in my career, so started, scaled, and sold a business that had organic sales in US, Europe, and Asia. So know a lot about how you segment the market and sequence sales. Just one other observation about what's missing and what can we learn in building bridges. I get the sense with a lot of German deep tech and climate tech founders, 'cause there are so many, that they're often missing human-centered design and early UX testing. And I think in Africa, every startup has human-centered design because you need to be thinking about sales immediately. And I feel like that's a great area of strength. And when we're thinking about human capital development, using African talent in Germany and Europe more broadly, UX and human-centered design is probably a great area of strength for Africans, but obviously they would need to develop empathy and insight on German or European customers. So there'd need to be different sorts of collaborations to make that possible and successful.
Thank you for these great insights. And I think with those as a basis, I would love to open up the room for some questions from the audience before we're heading to lunch. So please raise your hands. We're going to pass the microphone around, and yeah, looking forward to hearing your questions and then to the panelists.
Everyone hungry?
Everyone is ready for lunch. No startup access, doesn't matter anymore. We just want to eat. There we've got Kave.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I grew up in South Africa, Durban girl in the room, but I'm originally from the DRC, and now I've been living in Berlin for the last 9 years, and I'm a founder as well. And one of the points you all talked about is this really trust element. And when you all spoke about it, I thought about Inventing Anna. I don't know if you all watched the series on Netflix. And you could all watch how she was really trying to build trust with this banker, and everybody else just like she could raise money. But also it just reminded me why so many great founders don't have access to capital, and because they just don't have the network. They just don't know that person they need to have tea or coffee or lunch with, you know. And I'm wondering how we here, sitting here right now, or the German community of founders and investors can really start building these tables where we have tea and lunches actually with people we want to invest in. Yeah, it's really like we need those rooms.
So just one idea, like for those, I heard the AWS lady also saying that she offers mentoring. If you were to offer office hours, right, where people, even if they book an online appointment with you, where you're like on LinkedIn, you know, this is my office hour, and you know, if you're an entrepreneur, you want to apply to have time with me, like I think that would be amazing. But just putting it out there, what kind of time you have available and making it more universally acceptable is a great starting point.
Thank you for that answer. For Daniel, I have a question. Have you had other companies that you've invested in Africa, South Africa, besides Michel's company or Philip's company?
If I've met other companies?
If you have made investments in other companies.
We by ourselves, we do not do investments. So we are just an advisory company. So we are connecting the founders, the entrepreneurs, or private equity to do a transaction. Yeah, so that's our role. I would say I was just thinking about it. So how can you prepare if you want to go to Europe, or especially to Germany? And I think the bad news is the mandate of most of the financial sponsors here in Germany, and I would also say for the European sponsors, I would say you cut off 85%, 90% of the financial sponsors who don't have a global mandate. So the European market is mostly driven by sponsors who are covering only the GSA region, Western Europe, and when it comes then to the US or whatsoever. So that's a big obstacle, yeah? So, and what is the answer besides that? I mean, I think over time it will change, yeah? Events like this will help on that, and success stories like Comex will help on that. But also, I would say it's important to make, I mean, some of you mentioned that it was a coincidence that you founded it in South Africa and Europe or so on, yeah? Okay, that's totally fine as a starting point. Nevertheless, when it comes to the next phase, I think you have to establish a story around that. What is the rationale behind it? Yeah, so it's the story, okay, it's great fun or something like that. That's not a story for investors, yeah? They are extremely conservative and always, even if there is no story, then try to prepare it, yeah? Make a rationale out of it. And I think thinking and seeing it from both angles, from South Africa or from wherever your company is located, and from a European perspective, that would help to raise the interest from European funds to invest into South Africa. Yeah, and I'm convinced that that will increase because we are lacking opportunities. So at least for the last years, there was much more money called dry powder in the funds, which they cannot spend in attractive opportunities here in Europe. So I'm convinced that the more they know about this continent, this specific country, the more the openness to invest there will rise, and making yourself familiar with those investors, etc. Everything is one part of this puzzle to make it a convincing story.
Measuring and reporting impact, even at the early stage, is the #1 leverage point that African startups have with European investors, right? So Jenny and I have been meeting with a number of potential strategic partners in capital raising in Europe this week. And the European Venture Philanthropy Association, TONIC, the Global GIIN, Global Impact Network, these are all kind of platforms that exist. And very few African early stage entrepreneurs are thinking about impact metrics, but that's the easiest way for European investors to have an out-of-mandate deal in Africa, because anyone who has an impact mandate can, if you have the impact metrics, they can potentially make an exception. And I think this will be a huge area of growth. And how we break down corporates, right? Like Launch Africa talks to a lot of corporate venture capital companies. Virtually none in Europe have an African mandate. Many of them have an India mandate. We're like, we're 5 years behind India. Don't you want to start building your pipeline now? Right, and much better valuations.
And also one very positive signal from my side, maybe it's my last word. So I think when I'm asked how did it went, so was it easy to do the transaction with COMEX, or was it more complicated compared to other transactions? And I would always say, okay, that's approximately as complicated as trading a company which is located in Berlin and Vienna, for example. Yeah, so it's in your case it was exactly the same. So the sentiment should change. Yeah, it was absolutely by far not the most complicated transaction, and especially not with regard to being located also not in Europe, besides Europe. Yeah, so I have seen many more complicated transactions between the Netherlands and Germany, for example. Yeah, that's always a nightmare.
Marcel, you had your hand up earlier. This will be our last question before we head to lunch, and then obviously we'll be continuing these conversations individually. So over to you, Marcel.
I'll keep it short. My name is Marcel. I co-founded 8 Pioneers in 2020, and nowadays I'm a Dream VC fellow and chief of staff at Praxis Science. My question is for Philip. You mentioned your university journey, and I wonder if we just need more universities and programs in universities that start accelerator programs that remind people that you can start a company. And maybe now you want to do this by building a bridge back to Africa with your universities that you have attended to.
So 100%. And I actually loved that thinking. If I did have more time over the last 4 years when I was building COMEX, I probably would have been engaging more around that. So we actually looked at each other recently, Pete, Chris and I, and it was like, this whole transformation was going on, scaling up COMEX to 100 plus people, doing a deal, then working with private equity to pull some levers. And we looked at each other, and we sometimes don't have that in mind, how crazy this exchange program shaped all of our lives without us knowing it in that moment. And how grateful we were back then for the great experience and the people met, but this was a real vector shift. And this is again like very, very subjective, I guess. But for me, meeting my co-founders was the most epiphanal, interaction that drove the success of COMEX, I would say. There's many more things you have to go through as founders, from getting to know each other very well, getting very, very well to know the things you don't like about each other, and then still pushing forward. And I always felt that the tenure, because it's now been 10 years that I've met those two, right? Although we only have been working for 5 years together, that this really helped, and that you only get context. And that's, I think, pretty much to your point. I would have never had that context without a proper university exchange program that threw me into the deep ends, not only visiting lectures, 2 hours a week and for the rest going surfing, but actually being at the GSB, being in an extremely diverse environment with people from Nigeria, Mozambique, Ghana, everything, right? Driving through, going from finance lectures onto a Jeep and driving towards, a economic center in Khayelitsha in the townships in South Africa, understanding that African entrepreneurship, which I'm not the expert in, but it gave me so much context that made it just easier to build that trust level we just heard before. And it's actually an epiphany right now how much I'm not thinking about that, how crazy this Excel is, and for other people it always seems like, a big thing. And maybe there was also the one thing we discussed, I think, earlier through the panel. For us, it was just completely clear that this is one company and one COMEX. This is not a service center we built somewhere where we don't know the people. This is not like different perks and benefits in 2 locations. It was one thing. And I guess we just got, lucky that we had the confidence and never saw it differently. And I fully agree with you that, through exchange programs and the university time, that could have not been established, I think, personally, yeah. 100%.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, I've seen there was one very, very last question. Where was that?
Here.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, I'm Franziska. I'm founder of a fintech/fund called Uncap. I'm here with my CTO Reuven. And what we do, we basically provide redeemable equity funding to entrepreneurs in Africa. We're now at about 80 deals. We've done 50 of those over the last 7 to 8 months. And something that I'm missing a little bit in the discussion so far is we know that most of the capital to be invested in Africa sits outside of Africa. And I think a danger that comes with that is that there's a lot of copy-pasting how we invest in companies. And that means that there's, in my opinion, not enough conversations around, do we need different fund structures? Do we need longer fund cycles? Do we need different ways to invest in companies? Because maybe we actually don't want to sell all the great scaling companies to global players so that the ownership and the IP actually leaves the continent. But maybe we want more founders to actually keep the ownership for longer, keep the kind of like, keep the African perspective longer on the continent, where it means we need to be more innovative around venture debt, redeemable equity, dividend structures, etc. But then also the way we invest. Because I see your point, right? It's very hard to get access to investors because we still think you need to network yourself to an investor, you need to schmooze them, you need to be able to pitch how a Silicon Valley founder pitches, etc. But that's a paradigm that we ourselves set up over the last decades. Like, it doesn't need to be that way, because that way we'll never reach a founder that is somewhere north in Kenya, fantastic entrepreneur who didn't go to university, who doesn't know Launch Africa, he doesn't know how to network himself to kind of like an investor in Nairobi. And I'm just like super curious to hear whoever, Margaret or whoever, yeah.
From incubators, accelerators, and other entrepreneurs. So yes, the entrepreneur needs to have the wherewithal to find someone else in the established ecosystem, incubator, accelerator, university professor, someone with some trust, but we pride ourselves in investing in, as I said, raw talent, people who didn't go to Y Combinator or didn't go to Harvard Business School, right? So for sure, I agree with you. We should, Junaid, we'll love to talk to you about venture debt, revenue-based financing. We have many conversations with debt capital facilities to try and figure out how do we bring them earlier into the African ecosystem, especially with local currency, right? The DFIs are like, we'd love to help you, but like, yes, we'll do a Series B venture debt. Like, so for sure, we totally agree that there needs to be new ways of funding both debt and equity. Crowd-based funding, of course, you know, like we were at an event talking about retail investors in many different countries, right? Like Africa, you know, we're seeing Nigerians especially keen to do retail investing, and that goes back to data and governance. If there's transparent data about the state of the private capital markets in Africa, there's the possibility of getting more African capital into private capital markets, both pension funds, corporate venture capital, and retail investors. And you know, look forward to talking to you. Launch Africa brought in 230 plus retail LPs, so totally new capital into the continent. We're frustrated that most of it is European and the US. African family offices they felt the need to diversify off of the continent because their operating companies are in African currency. But as we have more successful exits, we'll have more African capital, both institutional and retail, investing in the ecosystem. So, yeah.
I mean, I think, I'm not sure if I can fully respond to your question, but wanted to get back to the entrepreneur, if that's just okay for 2 minutes. And that is, I cannot speak to your question because I've never raised a fund in my life, right? We did a bootstrap business in a specific segment that allowed us to bootstrap. And when I hear that, you know, entrepreneurs spending their time and getting frustrated around not getting access to investors, my heart kind of cringes, because we just never did that because we didn't know it any better. Maybe it would have helped us, but the one thing we focused on was just being extremely useful. And I know there were many things that came our way, but once you drop €4.5 million of EBITDA, it's not a problem to get attention. So, and this simplifies, you know, all the luck we had and all the timing we had, right? But the point is really that when I hear about entrepreneurs getting frustrated, I would love, you know, them to not think about investors as a necessity in the first place, and by getting yourself the confidence of understanding that it's going to be you ultimately, and you know, if you don't get access to specific people and don't get their attention, then this just means right now you're not interesting to them, and that could also be okay. And it doesn't matter if that's fair or not, if you perceive this is fair, because life's not fair. But the point is, if you really focus on being useful day after day after day after day, you eventually end up in a solution that will allow people to live better lives, you know, run better businesses, and eventually they put money on the table and buy this from you. And specifically the last 10 years have shown us how much overfunding has happened in, you know, immature and not so valuable solutions. I think now it's bootstrapping time, baby. And I think it's like the real chance on like getting the founders out who maybe work independent from investors, although I know it's very, very hard for specific business models. But that was our story, and we felt, I always felt like focusing on solutions is more fun than waiting for the investor.
Philip, I just have to jump in because I totally agree with you about enterprise sales and growing organically. But many, many African entrepreneurs are in families where there is no cash cushion, you know, tons of pressure to stay in the corporate job or consulting job or government job, do anything to bring cash in. So if you are in a zero cash cushion environment, you do need some venture capital or others, grant funding or other sources of capital, especially when you've done a proof of concept and you know that you have something that's workable. So I just want to recognize that you know, there's many entrepreneurs who do need some seed funding to really get their proof of concept out of the garage.
Thanks, guys. And I think we are about to wrap up and continue over lunch. I would like to finish this with maybe one last statement also to your point, Franziska. What we need, and I hope some policymakers or influential people are listening to this, is like initiatives like the Startup Act in African countries. I mean, it breaks my heart as in, like, you know, I consider myself African in heart after having lived there for 5 years. It breaks my heart working with African founders and helping them actually to set up their entities in Europe to increase the chance of funding, meaning like IP transfer, you know, because, and that at the end will not help the local ecosystem to receive like money, tax returns or whatsoever, but this is simply due to the reason because the policies are so like poorly designed when it comes to, you know, exchange control, regulations, IP protection, that it is just like absolutely not advisable to have your company in Africa. And I think this is where policymakers need to wake up to make it. And it's, in my opinion, well, I'm not very very politically versed, but like I do not see it too complicated to, you know, as other countries have done it, to create certain incentive schemes to make it more attractive to actually have you know, companies domiciled locally, which can unlock such a tremendous potential for these ventures, the countries, cities, whatever. And I really hope that we'll see much more of that, you know, happening to actually help capital not necessarily flow out of Africa, but actually make it more attractive to actually be there, flow into Africa, stay there, and grow from there. That being said, let's get some food. Thank you, guys. Audience online, we'll be back in about 30 minutes here with continuation of the program. So see you in a second.